the spring of 2006, the national president of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club issued an order from Texas to dissolve a troubled Canadian chapter. The plan was straightforward. A group of men would be stripped of their patches and sent home. It was the kind of internal disciplinary action that outlaw motorcycle clubs carried out when chapters stopped performing. But the man chosen to execute that order in Ontario had spent 40 years proving that he did not follow instructions. He interpreted them. 8 men drove to his farm in southwestern Ontario for a meeting they believed they would return from. None of them did. This is the story of the order that became the largest mass murder in Canadian biker history. Jeffrey Pike and the Bandidos Empire. In the summer of 2005, Jeffrey Pike became the national president of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. He was based in Texas, where the club had been founded in 1966, and from that position, he ran what federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most powerful criminal motorcycle organizations in the world. The Bandidos had 300 chapters across 22 countries. They were the second largest outlaw motorcycle club on the planet, behind only the Hells Angels. And Jeffrey Pike ran all of it with the kind of authority that left no room for interpretation. Pike did not manage the Bandidos the way a corporate executive manages a company. He managed it the way a man manages an organization where the consequences of disobedience are physical and permanent. Federal prosecutors documented that Pike issued secret orders to his vice president, John Portillo, about assaults and murders designed to maintain control of the club's territory and profits. He ordered hits on men who threatened the Bandidos' dominance in Texas. He authorized a war against a smaller club called the Cossacks that culminated in a gun battle at a Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco in May 2015 that left 9 people dead and produced 177 arrests. That was the kind of man Jeffrey Pike was. And in the spring of 2006, he gave an order to his Canadian chapter that would produce the largest mass murder in the history of the Canadian biker world. The order itself was not unusual by the standards of the organization he ran. It was an instruction to strip the Toronto Bandidos of their membership and dissolve their chapter. Clubs that were not performing. Clubs that were causing problems. Clubs that had become liabilities rather than assets. In the Bandidos world, those clubs got dealt with, and Pike had the authority to deal with them however he saw fit. But what happened when that order reached the man Pike had chosen to execute it in Canada was something that, even by the standards of the 1% world, was extraordinary. 8 men were murdered in a barn in southwestern Ontario on the night of April 7, 2006. Their bodies were loaded into cars and driven to a field outside a small hamlet called Shedden before dawn. And the man who carried out Pike's order did not just pull their patches. He decided that pulling patches was not enough. That man was Wayne Kellestine. And to understand what he did with the authority Pike gave him, you have to understand who Wayne Kellestine was before the Bandidos ever existed. Wayne Kellestine. About 7 minutes along the Talbot line from Shedden sits the even smaller settlement of Iona Station. A handful of houses, 1 business, 1 stoplight. And half a mile west of the Cowal-McBride Cemetery on Aberdeen line, the farm that Wayne Kellestine had called home for 30 years. From the road, the property announced itself clearly. Ancient maples and oaks that had once lined the roadside had been deliberately cut down years earlier to give Kellestine an unobstructed view of anyone approaching along Aberdeen line. A heavy rusted iron gate stood at the outer perimeter with an aged surveillance camera fixed on one of its pillars watching the road. 4 Doberman pinschers, each with its own doghouse, patrolled the inner yard, none of them neutered so their aggression would stay high. A second fence topped with barbed wire enclosed the house and the barn beyond it. On the door of the farmhouse, a Latin phrase had been fixed for anyone who made it that far to read. Cedit eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eius. Kill them all. Let God sort them out. The house itself was a 2-story white wooden structure, expansive but long overdue for maintenance. The toilets flushed, manually with buckets because the plumbing had stopped working. The well water was contaminated with E. coli, so the family bought bottled water in bulk. The hot tub sat empty. But the living room was large and furnished around a traditional stone fireplace, and the games room off it held a pool table that in the farm's heyday had been the center of some of the finest parties in Elgin County. Beer flowing. A band playing old-time rock and roll. Men greeting each other with "love you, bro," and meaning it. Wayne Kellestine loved those nights. He danced jigs and sang songs badly and filmed everything with a camera he carried through the rooms. He filmed his daughter Cassie's first steps and his wife Tina's devotion and told her on camera of his undying love for her. He also filmed a man raping on the pool table and kept the camera rolling as she sat crying afterward. That was Wayne Kellestine. Both of those things at the same time. Throughout the house, Nazi memorabilia covered the walls and shelves. Helmets and plates and mortar shells and flags and an SS sign on the barn from his old gang, the Annihilators. A swastika had been cut into the surrounding field, large enough to be visible only from a plane. His business was called KKK Securities. He signed his emails with his personal code for killer. Hitler was his self-described arch-hero. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, Nazi imagery does not represent white supremacy in the conventional sense. It represents rejection of mainstream society and contempt for its institutions, particularly law enforcement. But in Kellestine's case, the line between symbol and sincere admiration was less clear than it was for most. To his neighbors, he was a different man entirely. At the Holland House Tavern in Iona Station, where he drank regularly, the owner Marty Angenent had known him for decades. Marty described him simply, a fair and generous man with a good sense of humor and a better sense of loyalty. When the Holland House had suffered a string of break-ins years earlier, Kellestine had made it stop. No money changed hands. It was a gentleman's agreement between two men who understood each other. The neighboring farmers knew him as the man who threw the finest pig roasts in the area and could always be counted on for cold beer. He always waved, always smiled, until you were in his field without an invitation. Then you saw a different look entirely. Eyes that, according to one account, would stare through your soul and make you regret being born. Wayne Earl Kellestine was born on May 1, 1949 in Ontario. His criminal career had begun in the early 1980s and had never stopped. Holocaust MC from 1982 to 1988. Annihilators MC from 1988 to 1999. Loners MC from 1999 to 2001. Bandidos from 2001 to 2006. When the Outlaws had expanded into Canada in 1977, he tried to join and was turned away as a heat score. A man whose criminal visibility was so constant that being around him attracted police attention to everyone in the vicinity. The rejection did not change his behavior. It simply redirected it. In 1991, he was charged with shooting and wounding another biker. In 1999, when the Hells Angels were absorbing roughly 160 Ontario bikers in a mass patchover, Kellestine refused. Two Hells Angels associates responded by attempting a drive-by shooting on him on October 22, 1999. A search of his property the following day turned up 3 semi-automatic weapons, 3 rifles, a 12-gauge shotgun, and ammunition. He had been banned from owning firearms twice in his life. The cash on Aberdeen line existed regardless. A body had surfaced near his property years earlier. David O'Neill, a cop killer and potential informant, was found in a shallow grave with 3 bullet wounds from a .38 caliber revolver. He had been buried from the neck down with his head left above the ground as a message. Kellestine was never charged, but the path to the dumping ground was one that only a couple of people could have known. Bikers do not kill police officers. It brings too much attention, but they do kill informants. And Kellestine had a 40-year reputation for understanding exactly where that line was and operating right up against it. Throughout those 40 years, he had repeatedly won early release from prison by promising officials he would cut his ties to guns, drugs, and outlaw bikers. He never did. The National Parole Board had noted in his file that he acknowledged his primary risk area was biker involvement and that local police were opposed to his release due to his ties to organized crime. He was released anyway, because Wayne Kellestine understood that the parole system rewarded the right promises and he had been making the right promises for decades without any intention of keeping them. Local police described him in terms that required no elaboration. He is a guy who, if you were to meet him, the hair on your neck would stand on end. This is one scary individual. By the spring of 2006, Kellestine had spent 30 years on Aberdeen line building a world on his own terms. He was 56 years old. He had survived drive-by shootings, murder charges, and 4 decades of criminal activity. He was a Bandidos member living in southwestern Ontario, waiting for an order from Texas that would give him an opportunity he had been building toward his entire life. When Jeffrey Pike's instruction arrived, Kellestine did not treat it as an administrative task. He treated it as permission. The Canadian Bandidos. The Bandidos did not arrive in Canada by design. They arrived because a small motorcycle club in Chatham, Ontario had run out of options. The Loners Motorcycle Club had been operating in Ontario for years when the Hells Angels began their systematic absorption of the province's outlaw motorcycle landscape in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Angels moved through Ontario with the efficiency of an organization that had done this before on multiple continents. Satan's Choice patched over. The Paradise Riders patched over. Club after club either joined the Hells Angels or faced the consequences of refusing. The Loners in Chatham understood what was coming and understood that standing against the Hells Angels alone was not a viable strategy. Their solution was to find a larger organization to align with. On May 22, 2001, the Chatham chapter of the Loners patched over to the Bandidos as probationary members, becoming full members on December 1, 2001. They were now part of the second largest outlaw motorcycle organization in the world, with chapters across the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. On paper, it was a significant upgrade in protection and standing. In practice, it introduced a set of internal dynamics that would prove far more dangerous than anything the Hells Angels had directly threatened them with. The Canadian Bandidos were almost immediately divided between 2 factions. The Toronto-based group known informally as the No Surrender Crew and the Winnipeg chapter that had formed separately and operated under different leadership with different loyalties and different ideas about how the Canadian operation should be run. The tensions between these 2 groups were not simply organizational disagreements. They were personal. They were about money and drug trafficking routes, and the kind of status disputes that in the 1% world have only one language for resolution. The Hells Angels, meanwhile, had not stopped applying pressure simply because the former Loners had found a new affiliation. They moved further into Ontario, surrounding the Bandidos and picking off members one by one. Attempted assassinations, drive-by shootings, offers of protection to men who were willing to switch sides. The Angels understood that an organization divided internally and under external pressure simultaneously was an organization that could be dismantled. By 2006, the Canadian Bandidos had shrunk from a club with genuine presence across the province to approximately a dozen members in Ontario. Some of them were in their 40s and still living with their parents. Many of them had previously been rejected by the Hells Angels and had joined the Bandidos partly by default. Half of them did not even own motorcycles. These were not powerful men. They were men who had wanted to be part of something and had found the only organization still willing to have them. But they wore the patch, and the patch meant they were subject to the authority of the Bandidos' national leadership in Texas. And in the spring of 2006, that authority was about to be exercised in a way none of them could have anticipated when they first put on their colors. The immediate trigger was the murder of a drug dealer named Sean Dowse in December 2005. Dowse had been involved in Bandidos' drug operations and had allegedly crossed the Winnipeg faction in a way that set off a chain of events the organization could not contain through normal channels. The Winnipeg chapter blamed members of the Toronto group for the fallout. The Toronto group disputed that account. The dispute escalated through the early months of 2006 until it reached the desk of Jeffrey Pike in Texas. Pike's response was an order. Strip the Toronto Bandidos of their membership. Dissolve the chapter. Start fresh with a new Canadian operation built around the Winnipeg faction that he considered more reliable and more aligned with how the Bandidos were supposed to operate. It was a clean organizational solution to a messy internal problem. But the order had to be executed by someone on the ground in Ontario, and the man Pike chose to execute it was Wayne Kellestine. What Pike ordered and what Kellestine decided to do with that order were two different things, and the distance between those two decisions is where 8 men lost their lives. The road to April 7th. The plan, as Pike had issued it from Texas, was straightforward. Bring the Toronto Bandidos together, strip them of their patches, dissolve the chapter, send them home without their colors and without their standing in the organization. It was the kind of internal disciplinary action that outlaw motorcycle clubs carried out when chapters failed to meet expectations. Humiliating, final, but not lethal. Somewhere between that order and the night of April 7, 2006, the plan changed. Kellestine had been building his case against the Toronto members for months. His primary target was Jamie Flans, a tow truck driver and prospective Bandidos member, who Kellestine argued was a police informant. His reasoning was specific. Another member had been arrested in connection with the Sean Dowse murder, and Flans had remained free. In Kellestine's logic, that could only mean one thing. Flans was talking to police, and the arrest had been the result of information he had provided. It was the kind of reasoning that in the 1% world required no proof beyond the suspicion itself. The accusation was enough to make it real. Lead prosecutor Kevin Gowdy would later describe the meeting Kellestine organized as a deliberate ruse, not a genuine attempt to resolve the dispute between the Toronto and Winnipeg factions, not a straightforward execution of Pike's order to pull patches, a trap. Kellestine reached out to the Toronto members in the days leading up to April 7th, framing the gathering as a mandatory church meeting to address the allegations against Flans and discuss the future of the Canadian chapter. A reconciliation meeting, a chance for both sides to clear the air. He told them it was important that everyone attend. At the same time, he was contacting the Winnipeg affiliates with a different message: be prepared for the worst. On the evening of April 6th and into April 7th, 2006, the Toronto Bandidos made their way to southwestern Ontario. Jamie Flans drove Paul Sinopoli to the meeting. Because of the Dowse murder investigation, a surveillance team from York Regional Police had been following Flans and tracked his car from Keswick down Highway 401 to Iona Station. The police had no idea what was waiting at the end of that drive. Neither did the 8 men inside those vehicles. Michael Sandom arrived at the farm ahead of the Toronto members. Sandom was the leader of the Winnipeg Bandidos faction and a former police officer who had been suspended from the East St. Paul force in 2002 after the RCMP provided photographs of him attending a Bandidos function while on official leave. He had subsequently resigned from the force and committed himself fully to the Bandidos. He came to Aberdeen line that night wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a rifle. He positioned himself in the loft of the barn before the Toronto members arrived. The 8 men who drove to Wayne Kellestine's farm on the night of April 7, 2006, believed they were attending a meeting. They believed the gathering was about the future of their chapter and the allegations surrounding Jamie Flans. They believed that whatever happened that night, they would drive home afterward. None of those things were true. And the man who had invited them had known that from the moment he sent the messages asking them to come. The 8 men before. The night of April 7, 2006 became the worst mass murder in Canadian biker history. It was first a gathering of 8 men who had driven to a farm in southwestern Ontario because someone they trusted had asked them to come. Understanding who those 8 men were matters because the story of what happened to them is not the story of powerful criminals meeting a violent end inside a world they had built on violence. It is the story of men at the bottom of that world being summoned to their deaths by the organization they had dedicated themselves to. John Mushadere was 48 years old and believed to be the president of the Bandidos in Canada. He was known as Boxer. Frank Salerno was 43 and the president of the Toronto chapter. Everyone called him Bam Bam. Luis Raposo, known as Chopper, was 41. George Kriarakis, known as Crash, was 28. George Jessam was 52. Paul Sinopoli was 30. Jamie Flans was 37, a tow truck driver and a prospective member rather than a fully patched one. Michael Trotta was 31, an associate member who had not yet earned full standing in the organization. 6 of the 8 were full patch Ontario members. Flans and Trotta had not yet reached that level. All 8 were from the Greater Toronto area. A star witness who was present that night would later describe them in terms that stripped away any mythology the patch might have suggested. They were at the very bottom rung of biker gangs, he said. Some were in their 40s but still lived with their parents. They were not making any money. Many of them had been rejected by the Hells Angels. Half of them did not even own a motorcycle. This detail matters. The men who drove to Aberdeen line that night were not the powerful figures that the word Bandidos might conjure. They were men who had wanted to belong to something and had found in this organization the only version of belonging available to them. They wore the patch because the patch gave them an identity that nothing else in their lives had offered. And they drove to that farm because the organization that had given them that identity had told them to come, and they had no reason to believe it would destroy them for doing so. Jamie Flans had been accused by Kellestine of being a police informant. The accusation was the pretext for the entire gathering. But Flans was a tow truck driver from Keswick, whose greatest crime in Kellestine's eyes was remaining free after another member's arrest. He drove Paul Sinopoli to the meeting that night. Sinopoli was 30 years old. He had not been accused of anything. He came because members were expected to come when the church called them together. After the bodies were found and the families came to the field outside Shedden to place their memorials, the things they left behind said something about who these men actually were. A white cross with a small fence around it, a blue spruce, orange chrysanthemums, and a Toronto Maple Leafs jersey with the number 93. Doug Killer Gilmore had been someone's hero. The night of April 7th. The Toronto members arrived at the farm on Aberdeen line through the evening and into the early hours of April 8th. They came through the rusted iron gate past the surveillance camera and the Dobermans, and into the barn where Wayne Kellestine was waiting for them. The meeting they believed they had been called to was already something else entirely. Michael Sandham was in the loft above them, wearing a bulletproof vest and holding a rifle before the first man walked through the door. 2 other men stood outside the barn in the darkness, each holding a shotgun. The Toronto Bandidos had driven from the city to southwestern Ontario for a church meeting and walked into an ambush that had been prepared for them hours in advance. Luis Raposo was the first to die. He was shot and killed by Sandham almost immediately upon entering the barn. Kellestine fired his own weapon into the air and shouted at the remaining men to get on the floor. "Nobody move," he told them. "I am here to pull your patches." The men who were still alive did what they were told. They got on the floor. They believed that what Kellestine had said was what was actually happening, that this was a violent and humiliating end to their membership, but that they would survive it. They were held in the barn for several hours. What happened during those hours was documented in devastating detail by the star witness who stood outside with a shotgun watching the perimeter. The killings were not quick. They were not the result of a single moment of violence that escalated beyond what anyone had planned. They were deliberate and sequential. One by one, the men were taken outside and executed. 7 of the 8 were held captive for hours before being killed. All 8 died on the property at Aberdeen line. The weapons used that night included handguns, shotguns, and rifles. The sequence of the killings, the movements of the men involved, and the words spoken inside that barn would later be described to a jury over 6 months of testimony by more than 70 witnesses. The star witness, known only as MH, had been given full immunity and a new identity in exchange for his account of what he saw that night. His testimony described every detail of what had happened inside and outside that barn, from the first shot that killed Raposo to the last execution, carried out in the darkness before dawn. When it was over, Kellestine and the others loaded the bodies into the vehicles the Toronto members had driven to the farm. Close to dawn, they drove those vehicles approximately 10 miles east along the back roads of Elgin County to a field outside the hamlet of Shedden. They parked the cars in a laneway beside a tractor run at the edge of a field belonging to a retired dairy farmer named Russ Steele and his wife Mary. One body was rolled in an old carpet and placed in a trunk. The remaining 7 were left slumped in the seats of the vehicles with execution-style gunshot wounds to their heads. The killers walked away into the pre-dawn darkness and left 8 men in 4 cars at the edge of a field that Russ and Mary Steele could see from their kitchen window. By the time the sun came up on the morning of April 8, 2006, Wayne Kellestine was back on Aberdeen line. The farm was quiet. The Dobermans were in their kennels. The surveillance camera watched the empty road. And 10 miles away, in a field outside Shedden, 8 men who had driven from Toronto the night before for a church meeting were waiting to be found. Russ and Mary Steele had finished their breakfast cereal and were topping up their coffees in the kitchen of their farmhouse on Stafford Line when the phone rang just after 8 in the morning. It was their neighbor, Charlie McMullen. "Forbes tells me there is a mess out near your field," he said. "A bunch of cars out there. We are going out for a look-see." The Steeles had moved to their 95-acre property just 6 months earlier, looking for peace and quiet after selling their dairy farm in Kintore. They had raised celebrated red and white Holsteins there, including a 5-time All-American champion named Stelbro Renita Range. The new property was exactly what they had wanted: a circular gravel driveway, a pond with birch trees and an arched bridge, 8-foot deer and buffalo fencing along the perimeter, a gentleman's farm in a part of Ontario where the sounds were subdued and the pace of life matched the landscape. As Russ and Mary drove to the field, they considered 2 possibilities. Charlie and Forbes were known pranksters, and this had the feel of one of their jokes. Or it was city teenagers who had taken a joyride too far. By the time they arrived, they had already half decided it was nothing worth worrying about. Then they saw the vehicles. A gray Infiniti backed into the unused deer run. A tow truck with Toronto identification stenciled on its sides run off the shoulder of the road with a car still attached to its hoist. 2 more vehicles stuck deep in the mud of the field. 4 cars total sitting at the edge of their property in the early morning light. Forbes told them that as he had driven past earlier, he had seen 2 men running south through the field toward the tree line. "Good luck to them fellows getting back to Toronto in that direction," he said. Mary noticed one of the trunks was slightly ajar. She told Russ not to touch anything. They called 911, then drove back to the road and waited. Russ walked alongside the vehicles, calling out license plate numbers, while Mary scribbled them onto a notepad from the glove compartment. They had watched enough television to know what a crime scene looked like. They did not yet know they were standing in the middle of one. OPP Officer Carl Johnston was dispatched at 8:22 in the morning and arrived within 10 minutes. He peered through a semi-open window and saw a man with wounds to his face. He called for backup and EMS immediately. By the time his colleague, Officer Jeff Chandelier, arrived, the 2 men were moving carefully around the vehicles, preserving whatever evidence the muddy field had left intact. One officer opened the slightly ajar trunk and called out to the other. "Body." He moved to the gray Infiniti and looked through the window. Body. Ambulance attendant Lee Restorick confirmed rigor mortis had set in. They were dealing with multiple deaths, and the deaths were not recent. The initial assumption had been a few bodies. The reality was 8. One had been rolled in an old carpet and placed in a trunk with multiple bullet wounds. The remaining 7 were slumped in their seats with execution-style gunshot wounds to their heads. All 8 were from the Greater Toronto area. All 8 had driven to southwestern Ontario the previous evening for a meeting they believed they would return from. Mary called one of her daughters before heading to give her statement at the police detachment and left a voicemail message. "We found some bodies on the property, but we're okay." As a longtime dairy farmer, she was accustomed to being matter-of-fact. By early afternoon, more than 150 police officers had established a central command at the end of the Steele's driveway. Helicopters moved overhead. The 4 vehicles with the bodies still inside were removed from the field under covered transport and taken first to London and then to OPP headquarters in Aurelia. The Steeles returned home to find 56 voicemail messages waiting for them. Most were from media outlets as far away as London, England. In the aisles of Palmer's supermarket, less than a mile from where the bodies had been found, neighbors tried to make sense of what had happened in their fields overnight. Forbes asked Charlie what the Bandidos were. He had never heard of them. Charlie had not either. By that afternoon, the CBC comments section was filling with responses from people across the country who had. 8 dead bandidos, said one commenter that received approval from more than 100 readers. What is the problem? Russ and Mary sat at home shaking their heads. They did not judge. They just felt badly for all those families. And they were relieved that their old dog Winston had not heard anything in the night. Winston's hearing had been failing for months. Had he heard something, Mary would have gone out with a flashlight to investigate. And then who knows what might have happened on Stafford Line that night. The investigation moved faster than Kellestine had anticipated. Within hours of the discovery at the Steel Farm, OPP officers had established surveillance on the property at Aberdeen Line. By Sunday night, Kellestine was in custody. Brett Gardner, a 24-year-old from Calgary, and Frank Mather, a 40-year-old with no fixed address, were arrested alongside him. 2 others, Eric Neeson and his common-law wife Carrie Morris from Moncton, Ontario, were also charged. Neeson would later admit to lying to police and helping Kellestine construct a false alibi while being aware that others were destroying physical evidence. The charges against him and Morris were eventually reduced to accessories after the fact. The second wave of arrests came in June 2006 under an operation named Octagon. Winnipeg police arrested Dwight Mushy, 36, Marcelo Aravina, 30, and Michael Sandom, 36. Mushy and Sandom were full-patch Bandidos members. Aravina was a prospective member. Sandom, the former police officer who had been suspended from the East St. Paul force in 2002 after being photographed at a Bandidos function while on official leave, had positioned himself in the loft of the barn that night wearing a bulletproof vest. He had been the first to fire. He denied nothing about his role because there was nothing to deny. The evidence was overwhelming, and the star witness had seen everything. That star witness was a Bandidos associate known only as MH. He had been one of the 2 men standing outside the barn with shotguns on the night of April 7th. He had watched the sequence of killings from beginning to end. In exchange for his full testimony, he was given complete immunity from prosecution and a new identity. His account of what happened inside and outside that barn on the night of April 7, 2006, became the foundation on which the entire prosecution was built. The preliminary hearing began on January 9, 2007, under extraordinarily tight security. Kellestine gave reporters the finger on the first day and swore at a courtroom artist. A gag order was issued on all evidence. The full murder trial began on March 31, 2009, in London, Ontario. All 6 defendants pleaded not guilty. The jury heard from more than 70 witnesses over 6 months, making it the largest mass slaying trial in Ontario history. Final arguments were heard in October 2009. The Crown argued that the murders had grown out of rising tensions between the Toronto Bandidos and the Winnipeg chapter, and that the plan, which had originated as an order from the American leadership to strip the Toronto members of their patches, had escalated into mass murder under Kellestine's direction. The defense for each accused attempted to minimize individual involvement or argue that the killings had not been premeditated in the way the Crown described. None of those arguments survived contact with MH's testimony. On October 29, 2009, the jury returned its verdicts. Wayne Kellestine was found guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Michael Sandom was found guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Dwight Mushy was found guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Marcelo Aravena was found guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. Frank Mather was found guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. Brett Gardner was found guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of manslaughter. A first-degree murder conviction in Canada carries an automatic life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Justice Thomas Heaney described what had happened on Aberdeen Line as horrific acts of violence arising from a calculated power struggle that had been ordered from the Bandidos leadership in Texas and executed by the men in that barn with a ruthlessness that the court had rarely been asked to confront. Wayne Kellestine received 8 life sentences. He would not be eligible for parole until he was in his 80s. The man who had spent 40 years on Aberdeen Line building a world on his own terms had finally built something that the law could not look away from. "Kill them all, let God sort them out," had been the motto on his door for as long as anyone could remember. In the end, The sorting had been done by a jury in London, Ontario, and the result had been the same for every man who had stood in that barn on the night of April 7, 2006. While Wayne Kellestine was being led out of a London, Ontario courtroom in October 2009 with 8 life sentences, the man whose order had set the night of April 7th in motion was still free. Jeffrey Pike had been the national president of the Bandidos since mid-2005. He had given the instruction to strip the Toronto chapter of their membership. He had set in motion the chain of events that ended with 8 bodies in 4 cars at the edge of a field in southwestern Ontario. And for nearly a decade after those verdicts, he continued to run the Bandidos from Texas without facing any consequences for what his order had produced in Canada. Pike ran the Bandidos the way he had always run them, through authority enforced by violence and the threat of violence. Federal prosecutors documented that he had issued secret instructions to his vice president, John Portillo, about assaults and murders designed to protect the club's territory and profits across the United States. He ordered attacks on men who threatened Bandidos' dominance in Texas. He authorized wars against rival clubs when he determined that rivals had stepped too far into territory the Bandidos considered their own. In May 2015, that approach produced its most visible consequence. Pike had authorized a campaign against the Cossacks, a smaller Texas-based club that had been challenging Bandidos' territorial dominance by wearing a Texas bottom rocker without permission. That campaign culminated on May 17, 2015 at a Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco, Texas, where a confrontation between the two clubs and law enforcement left 9 people dead and produced 177 arrests. It was one of the deadliest biker confrontations in American history, and it happened because Jeffrey Pike had decided the Cossacks needed to be dealt with. 6 months after Waco, on January 2016, federal agents arrested Jeffrey Pike. He was 63 years old. The charges were racketeering and drug trafficking. Prosecutors described him as a ruthless killer who had used his position as national president to order violence across multiple states over multiple years. The trial that followed produced the outcome that the evidence demanded. A federal judge sentenced Jeffrey Pike to life in prison, plus 10 years. His vice president, John Portillo, received 2 consecutive life sentences, plus 20 years. The man who had given the order that Wayne Kellestine had turned into the largest mass murder in Canadian biker history had spent nearly a decade free after 8 men died in a barn in southwestern Ontario. But the organization he had built his authority around had produced enough evidence of enough crimes across enough years that the law eventually assembled a case that even the Bandidos' code of silence could not protect him from. Pike had issued his order in 2006, believing that what happened in Canada would be handled and contained within the organization. 8 men would lose their patches. A problem would be resolved. The Canadian chapter would be restructured under more reliable leadership. It was a transaction, not a massacre. But he had sent that order to Wayne Kellestine. And Wayne Kellestine had his own ideas about what the order meant and what it authorized him to do. The 8 men who drove from Toronto to a farm in Elgin County on the night of April 7, 2006, had no way of knowing that the organization they had devoted themselves to had already decided their fate. They came because they were told to come. They trusted the club that had given them their identity and their standing and their sense of belonging in a world that had not offered them much else. That trust was the last thing they extended before Wayne Kellestine and Michael Sandom and the men in that barn took everything else away. Jeffrey Pike is serving life plus 10 years in a federal penitentiary in the United States. Wayne Kellestine is serving 8 concurrent life sentences in a Canadian penitentiary with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The 8 men they put in those cars are still in the field outside Shedden in the way that the dead remain in the places where they died. Not physically, but permanently. Wayne Kellestine carried out an order that produced 8 bodies in a field outside Shedden. Jeffrey Pike gave that order from Texas and spent a decade free before a federal court caught up with him in 2016. Both men built their lives around the 1% code, and both men ended up exactly where men who live by that code eventually end up. Click the next video to find out what that code actually demands.